UPS plane crash.
UPS plane crash.
The UPS plane crash.
UPS plane crash in Kentucky.
The quiet stillness before dawn always carried a strange charm at regional cargo hubs. And the same was true on the morning UPS Flight 2976 lifted its wheels off the tarmac for the last time. Ground crews remembered the faint rosy hue edging over the horizon, the subtle hum of tractors pulling dollies across concrete still slick with night condensation, and the rhythmic call-outs of workers going through their early morning muscles memory routines. Most cargo flights left before the passenger terminals were even awake, and 2976 was no exception. What set that morning apart, and what made the minutes before the takeoff of that aircraft stay burned into the memories of those who witnessed them, was not anything dramatic or foreboding, but the entirely ordinary silence of a shift running exactly on schedule. It was the sort of clean, unremarkable start that made what happened next so devastating. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. UPS Flight 2976 was scheduled as a short inter-hub transfer, a routine run between two domestic cargo centers that had seen thousands of similar flights over decades. The aircraft assigned was an aging but well-maintained twin-engine turboprop freighter, a type favored for its reliability, short runway performance, and forgiving nature in adverse conditions. For the pilots, a captain with more than 20 years in cargo aviation and a first officer who had been with the company for under 5, Flight 2976 was almost insultingly simple from a technical standpoint. It was a hop they could practically do in their sleep, though neither ever treated it with anything less than professionalism. In the hours that followed, the story of Flight 2976 would become a dense knot of questions, hypotheses, and desperate attempts to reconstruct a chain of events from cockpit voice recordings, radar data, and the heartbreaking fragments of radio transmissions preserved during the flight's final minutes. The investigation would uncover a mixture of mechanical realities, procedural decisions, environmental conditions, and tragic timing. None individually catastrophic, but together forming a sequence that could not be unraveled. It all began with the weather, which had shifted faster than forecast models predicted. Early morning departures often contend with rapidly changing conditions, but the dispatch briefings that day indicated nothing extraordinary. Cloud ceilings were workable, winds manageable, and visibility acceptable for instrument departure. What no one could foresee was the formation of a low-level turbulence pocket along the first leg of the planned route. Turbulence itself rarely brings down an aircraft, especially one sturdy enough to endure decades of cargo work, but it can be a factor, especially when layered atop mechanical challenges already in motion. The initial climb of Flight 2976 appeared normal on radar. The aircraft lifted, banked gently along the departure corridor, and began accelerating to its initial assigned altitude. The captain checked in with departure control, his voice calm and routine, offering not the slightest hint that anything was amiss. On the ground, the few who glanced at the ascending aircraft would later recall nothing unusual, just another cargo plane departing into the gloomy pre-dawn sky. Then came the first anomaly. Investigators later pieced together the timeline. An engine parameter fluctuated beyond its expected range about 3 minutes after takeoff. The aircraft's right engine, gritty from countless cycles, stressed from rapid temperature swings, and nearing the midpoint between major maintenance checks, showed signs of an internal airflow disruption. Whether it was an early compressor stall, a sensor misreading, or a small mechanical imbalance would remain debated, but whatever its origin, the fluctuation was enough to catch the first officer's attention. On the cockpit voice recorder, the conversation began with subtle, almost puzzled remarks. The first officer pointed out the erratic reading. The captain responded with calm acknowledgement, as seasoned pilots often do when dealing with minor irregularities. They discussed monitoring the gauge, referencing their procedures, and considering whether the anomaly was merely a transient blip. For a moment, it seemed to stabilize. They continued climbing. But when the aircraft hit the unexpected turbulence cluster, light at first, then sharply increasing, the right engine's fluctuations intensified. The combination of airflow instability and sudden vertical jolts triggered a more pronounced compressor stall. A muffled bang echoed through the fuselage, followed by a vibration that the cockpit microphones picked up. The captain instantly recognized the sound. Stalls of this type are survivable and, in most cases, recoverable with proper throttle adjustments. The pilots executed the relevant memory items, reducing power on the affected engine and attempting to re-establish stable airflow. The aircraft yawed slightly, requiring rudder correction. The stall momentarily cleared. What complicated matters, however, was the aircraft's weight distribution. Cargo flights rely on carefully balanced loading, and though the loadmasters for 2976 had adhered to procedure, turbulence had caused some of the unsecured lighter packages toward the rear to shift. Even a small shift can alter the aircraft's center of gravity, especially for turboprops designed to operate with tight margins. This shift added additional workload to the pilots, who now juggled engine stabilization, turbulence, and changing aerodynamic forces. The second compressor stall came moments later. This one was louder. The right engine's power output deteriorated rapidly, and the captain called for an immediate return to the departure airport. Air traffic control cleared them, beginning the steps for priority landing. The aircraft initiated a cautious turn, banking back toward the city now glowing more clearly beneath the rising sun. In the tower, controllers focused intently on the radar trace of the aircraft that was now deviating from its expected path but still responding to instructions. Inside the cockpit, the situation was worsening. The turbulence had not let up. The aircraft was fighting both asymmetric thrust and shifting aerodynamic loads. The captain, hands firm on the controls, made every adjustment possible to keep the aircraft's nose stable. The first officer retrieved the appropriate checklist, reading aloud in a steady but increasingly strained voice. Cargo aircraft like the one operating as Flight 2976 are designed to fly on one engine. Pilots train extensively for such scenarios, but what they cannot fully train for is the unpredictable intersection of engine failure, turbulence, shifting cargo, and rapidly narrowing options for altitude and terrain. As the aircraft descended through a dense layer of clouds, visibility dropped sharply. The cockpit recordings captured the whistling rush of wind, the rattling tremors running through the fuselage, and the hollowness of a freighter interior reverberating under strain. The pilots communicated with air traffic control, updating them on their altitude and situation, but their transmissions grew shorter as workload increased. Then a sudden drop, likely a downdraft, pushed the aircraft lower than intended. The left engine, still functioning, strained under the increased demand. The captain countered with throttle and control inputs, stabilizing the descent momentarily. But the combination of asymmetric thrust, turbulence, and disrupted airflow over the wings created a precarious aerodynamic condition. The aircraft entered what investigators would describe as the beginnings of an accelerated, uncommanded roll. The captain fought back, using every ounce of training, strength, and experience to prevent it from progressing into a full aerodynamic upset. They managed to halt the roll at first, but the aircraft lost precious altitude in the process. Ground proximity warnings began sounding. The flashing alerts and synthetic voice callouts echoed through the cockpit. The first officer read corrective procedures, the captain applied corrective control actions, and the two coordinated with near telepathic precision born from countless hours of training. But the environment outside the aircraft was uncompromising. A strong crosswind gust near the lower altitude corridor struck the freighter as it emerged from the cloud base, low enough that terrain features were becoming dangerously real. The captain attempted a controlled emergency landing, aiming for an open stretch visible off the aircraft's nose, a shallow slope of undeveloped land near the outskirts of a rural area. Had the aircraft maintained just a little more altitude, the landing might have been survivable. Yet fate, wind, and physics converged. The right wing dipped, scraped a cluster of low trees, and tore free from its mount. The aircraft spun, struck the ground at an angle, and skidded across the terrain in a violent spray of earth, metal, and burning fuel. The wreckage trail extended several hundred feet before the fuselage finally came to rest, fractured, smoldering, and eerily silent. Local residents, woken by the explosion, called emergency services immediately. First responders arrived within minutes, but the impact forces were too severe. The loss of both pilots was instantaneous. In the days that followed, investigators descended upon the crash site. They erected tents, marked debris fields, and began the painstaking work of reconstructing the tragedy. Every scrap of metal mattered. Every inch of twisted wiring or shattered component contributed to the broader understanding of what happened during those final minutes. The black boxes? the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder, were recovered relatively intact. Their analysis formed the backbone of the timeline investigators built. They cross-referenced the recordings with radar data, engine maintenance logs, cargo loading records, and meteorological information. They interviewed air traffic controllers, ground crews, and maintenance technicians who had worked on the aircraft in preceding weeks. The picture that emerged was not one of gross negligence or dramatic mechanical failure, but a convergence of smaller, compounding factors. The first was the engine's internal airflow issues. The compressor stalls had triggered the initial emergency, a mechanical problem not catastrophic on its own, but dangerous in conjunction with the turbulence. The second was the shifting cargo. Though loadmasters followed procedure and most heavy items were properly secured, lightweight items in the aft compartment had moved during turbulence, subtly altering the aircraft's center of gravity. Such shifts can destabilize aircraft control, especially in conditions requiring precise counteracting inputs. The third was the weather anomaly, unexpected turbulence forming earlier and more intensely than predicted. This turbulence accelerated the engine's instability and complicated recovery efforts. The fourth was altitude loss during the attempted return. The combined aerodynamic challenges, asymmetric thrust, environmental factors, and reduced visibility created a situation that left the pilots with minimal margin. None of these factors alone doomed the aircraft, but together, they created a chain reaction from which recovery became nearly impossible. The report, released months later, included recommendations aimed at preventing similar accidents. It emphasized enhanced monitoring of turboprop engine parameters, updated procedures for securing lightweight cargo, and improved turbulence prediction models for early morning operations. The report also highlighted the exemplary professionalism and skill of the flight crew, noting that their actions prolonged control of the aircraft far beyond what conditions might have otherwise allowed. For the families of the pilots, the report offered little comfort. Cargo pilots often work in the shadows, carrying the global supply chain on their shoulders while remaining largely invisible to the public. The loss of the crew of Flight 2976 served as a stark reminder of the risks they face daily, even on routes deemed routine. In the weeks after the crash, colleagues shared stories of the captain's mentorship, the first officer's dedication, and the thousands of safe flights both had completed. At the cargo hub where Flight 2976 originated, a small memorial was placed near the crew briefing room. A polished metal plaque engraved with their names, the aircraft tail number, and a simple message honoring their service. Pilots passing by often paused, touching the plaque lightly before continuing to their own flights. The memory of Flight 2976 became part of UPS's internal safety culture. Anonymous safety bulletins referenced it in training modules. Simulator sessions included scenarios inspired by the event. New pilots heard about it during orientation, not as a haunting tale, but as a lesson. A reminder of aviation's complexity, of how even experienced crews can be challenged by unpredictable combinations of mechanical, environmental, and operational factors. The weeks following the crash of UPS Flight 2976 brought a strange tension to the air around the cargo hub. Workers arrived at their shifts with familiar routines but unfamiliar expressions. Conversations took on a muted tone, as if every word had to navigate around a heavy, invisible presence. A sense of collective disbelief lingered, not only because of the tragedy itself, but because of the suddenness with which an ordinary morning had turned into an event etched into the memory of everyone connected to that flight. For the mechanics who had serviced the aircraft in the days prior, the news landed with an almost physical shock. Each of them replayed mental checklists of tasks performed: filter replacements, routine inspections, torque checks, tire pressure readings. They scrutinized their own memories, wondering if they had missed something subtle, something that might have foreshadowed the cascading events that unfolded in the air. Even though investigators quickly reassured them that no evidence pointed to maintenance errors, the emotional impact did not fade easily. Aviation culture demanded perfection, and the loss of an aircraft, even without maintenance-related faults, left everyone grappling with a sense of communal responsibility. The chief maintenance officer, a veteran of nearly 30 years, felt the weight more than most. He had risen through the ranks from line technician to supervisor and eventually to the top position overseeing the entire fleet at the hub. The responsibility he carried was more than administrative. It was deeply personal. He knew every aircraft by tail number, every quirk of their engine behavior, every stretch of wiring replaced, and every seal that had been upgraded over the years. When Flight 2976 went down, it was not just a mechanical system failing in his mind, it was as though a long-trusted companion had fallen silent. In the quiet corners of his office, he found himself replaying maintenance logs again and again, not in search of guilt, but in search of understanding. Across the airport, the loadmasters held their own silent reflections. Cargo distribution might seem simple to outsiders, who imagine parcels stacked like building blocks inside a hollow fuselage. But proper loading requires mathematical precision, spatial reasoning, and acute awareness of weight distribution. The loadmasters knew this intimately, and they carried immense pride in their craft. The realization that lightweight packages shifting during turbulence had played even a small role in the tragedy left them unsettled. Though their procedures were correct, the unpredictable nature of turbulence had outmaneuvered even the most experienced among them. One loadmaster, a young man only a year into the job, found himself replaying his portion of the shift dozens of times. He remembered the sound of tape sealing boxes, the thud of parcels settling into containers, and the click of latches securing doors. He remembered marking weight distribution forms, double-checking calculations, and conversing casually with his co-workers about weekend plans. After the crash, every small action took on disproportionate significance in his mind. He became quieter, arriving early for shifts, tidying equipment bins with unusual meticulousness, as though smoothing out the physical space around him might also smooth out the internal turbulence he carried. The pilots' families faced a different kind of aftermath, one marked by surreal moments where ordinary life continued despite an unfillable absence. The captain's spouse found herself staring at his still-open coffee tin one morning, unsure whether to put it away or leave it as it was. The first officer's fiancée kept replaying the final text message he sent before boarding, a casual note promising to bring home her favorite pastry after his return. Such small fragments of human routine became poignant relics, echoing the sudden void left behind. Funerals brought together colleagues from across the country. Cargo pilots who rarely saw each other outside of mandatory training gatherings found themselves standing shoulder to shoulder in respectful silence. They wore their uniforms not out of formality, but out of honor, recognizing the deep bond shared by those who navigate lonely skies in the quiet hours when most of the world sleeps. As the investigation progressed, the headquarters of the investigative team became its own world of tightly focused activity. Engineers pored over engine components laid out on long metal tables under bright white lighting. Meteorologists traced weather models on projection screens, comparing predicted turbulence maps against reconstructed flight paths. Specialists in flight data analysis listened to audio recordings repeatedly, isolating frequencies to differentiate mechanical sounds from environmental noise. One senior investigator, a woman with decades of experience dissecting aviation accidents, found herself particularly drawn to the human narrative woven into the technical evidence. She believed deeply that accidents were not merely mechanical puzzles, but intersections of human decision-making, environmental unpredictability, and machine behavior. Her approach emphasized empathy as much as precision. She often paused audio playback not to analyze the technical content, but to listen to the cadence of the pilots' voices, the subtle shifts that revealed their growing workload, their determination, and ultimately their final attempts at control. In another section of the investigative facility, aerodynamicists used digital twins of the aircraft model to simulate airflow disruptions that could occur during asymmetric thrust scenarios. They ran hundreds of simulations with minuscule variations in wind angles, thrust settings, and center of gravity shifts. Each simulation produced colorful wind flow visualizations, blues and greens in stable areas, reds and yellows in zones of instability. Clustered together, the simulation results formed a mosaic that revealed how narrow the margin had been between recoverable and unrecoverable conditions. Meanwhile, field investigators continued combing through the crash site. Despite the majority of crucial components having been recovered early on, the site still yielded smaller fragments. Buttons from the cockpit overhead panel, shards of composite materials from the wing surfaces, and even labels from cargo parcels that had been torn open during the impact. Each fragment was meticulously cataloged, photographed, and stored. It was not only about finding answers, It was about honoring the process, respecting the magnitude of what had occurred. Somewhere outside the perimeter fence, the land remained scarred by the crash. The soil showed darkened streaks where fuel had ignited. Vegetation lay flattened where the fuselage had skidded. Yet, in the days after the wreckage had been cleared, small signs of renewal began to appear. Grass began pushing through torn earth. Birds cautiously returned to the trees. Nature, indifferent yet resilient, continued its unbroken rhythm. Back at the cargo hub, the culture of safety deepened in ways both subtle and profound. Pilots engaged in longer pre-flight conversations, discussing not only standard procedures but also sharing personal heuristics, the little techniques each had developed over years of experience. These conversations fostered a renewed sense of camaraderie and mutual support. Airline operations managers noticed an increased number of voluntary safety reports submitted by crew members. Not reports of negligence or errors, but observations. Small things like unusual vibration patterns, minor discrepancies in instrument readings, or concerns about turbulence forecasts. The surge reflected an industry culture that embraced transparency rather than fear. Training departments began devising new modules inspired by the lessons learned from Flight 2976. Simulators were reconfigured to mimic the specific challenges encountered during the flight. Turbulence layers that behaved unpredictably, engine parameters fluctuating rapidly, and shifting center of gravity effects. Instructors encouraged pilots to make decisions based on evolving realities rather than rigid expectations. Trainees practiced scenarios where they had to reevaluate initial assumptions multiple times as new information emerged. The goal was not perfection, but adaptability, a highly valued skill in aviation. For the broader aviation community, the crash became a case study in complexity. Conferences hosted panel discussions exploring the incident from diverse angles: mechanical engineering, human factors psychology, meteorology, and even organizational culture. Experts emphasized how the layering of small, seemingly unrelated factors could intersect with catastrophic results. These discussions encouraged operators across the industry to examine their own systems with renewed clarity. Yet, beyond the professional circles, the emotional resonance remained strongest among those who had known the pilots personally. The captain's longtime friend, himself a pilot for a different cargo carrier, recalled shared stories from early in their careers. They had flown in smaller aircraft back then, hauling everything from mail to medical supplies into remote towns. They navigated snowstorms, mountain winds, and unpredictable rural airstrips with nothing but basic instrumentation and their own instincts. They had once joked that cargo pilots develop a sixth sense for weather because, unlike passenger flights, they couldn't always wait for ideal windows. They had to deliver on schedule. The friend held on to these memories as a testament to who the captain had been: steady, resourceful, and unflappable. For the officer, the remembrance took on a different character. He had been at the early peak of a promising career, climbing steadily through the ranks with an eagerness that inspired those around him. His flight instructors remembered him as meticulous, curious, and humble, someone who took pride in small improvements. He often asked questions during training sessions that reflected a genuine desire to understand not just what procedures existed, but why. Colleagues recalled his warm sense of humor and the way he made even routine overnight flights feel lighter by sharing stories or offering thoughtful observations about cities they only glimpsed from cockpit windows. As months passed, the airport community slowly regained its rhythm. New aircraft took up the routes once flown by Flight 2976. New pilots began their shifts. Ground crews continued their essential choreography. Yet a quiet thread of remembrance persisted beneath the surface. It appeared in the way ground crews sometimes glanced at the eastern horizon during early morning departures. It appeared in the way pilots lingered for an extra moment during exterior inspections, placing their hands softly on the aircraft's skin, as though acknowledging the trust they placed in the machine. It appeared in the annual memorial, modest but heartfelt, held every year on the anniversary of the crash. Among the many individuals touched by the tragedy, one unexpected group felt its impact deeply: a team of small business owners who relied heavily on overnight cargo shipments. They had never met the pilots, yet their supply chains depended on the reliability of flights like 2976. When the crash disrupted deliveries, they initially experienced frustration. But upon learning of the loss, that frustration transformed into reflection. Some wrote letters of condolence to the airline. One bakery owner sent boxes of pastries to the airport workers, including notes expressing gratitude for the unseen work they performed. These gestures, though small, reminded the cargo community that their work touched countless lives beyond airport fences. The psychological support system at the hub also shifted. Counselors visited regularly, offering private sessions for employees who needed a space to talk. Some workers attended once, others multiple times, and a few remained silent entirely, choosing instead to process their grief privately. But the presence of support created a sense of permission, reducing the stigma around acknowledging emotional impact in a field often perceived as stoic. Over time, Flight 2976 became part of the shared narrative among new hires. They heard the story not as a warning, but as an illustration of the profound responsibility they carried. The story emphasized that aviation is as much about humans working together as it is about machines adhering to physics. Every decision, whether in a cockpit, on a ramp, or in a control tower, connected to a larger network of people who relied on one another. The final echoes of the crash lived on, not as a specter of fear, but as a source of motivation. Workers found renewed purpose in meticulous routines, securing cargo straps with extra certainty, double-checking instrument readings with sharper focus, coordinating communications with clearer phrasing. Small acts accumulated, forming a foundation of resilience. The captain's family eventually established a scholarship for young aviators pursuing cargo aviation careers. They based the criteria on values he had exemplified: technical competence, unwavering professionalism, and humility. The first officer's family, moved by the outpouring of support, created a fund that provided financial assistance to the families of aviation workers facing unexpected hardships. Both initiatives grew rapidly, fueled by contributions from friends, colleagues, and individuals who had never met the pilots but felt connected through shared industry values. These legacies became living testaments to what Flight 2976 had come to represent, not simply a tragedy, but a reminder of courage, commitment, and the profoundly human dimension of aviation. In the years that followed, the crash site itself changed. Grass thickened, trees grew taller, and seasonal flowers bloomed in spring. The physical scars faded, but the place held a quiet gravity, as though the ground remembered. Occasionally, a passerby or local resident would pause by the small marker placed near the site, a simple stone engraved with the date and the flight number. No grand monument, no elaborate ceremony, just a modest tribute to lives lived with purpose. In retrospect, Flight 2976 became more than an accident report, more than a sequence of events reconstructed through telemetry and physical evidence. It became a shared story about human resilience in the face of nature's unpredictability, about the extraordinary demands placed on ordinary workers, and about the quiet threads of connection woven through a global industry. It stood as a reminder that every flight, no matter how routine, carries within it layers of unseen effort. Engineers crafting engines capable of enduring unimaginable forces, meteorologists decoding the sky's shifting moods, loadmasters arranging cargo with geometric precision, dispatchers calculating routes through invisible corridors of air, pilots balancing logic and instinct in moments of intense pressure. Flight 2976 embodied the fragile intersection of these forces. It illuminated how every role mattered, how every individual contributed to a larger fabric of safety and trust. And it reminded all who heard its story that aviation is a human endeavor at its core, not merely a technical one. As time passed, the memory of the pilots remained anchored in the hearts of those who had known them. Stories of their professionalism, compassion, and camaraderie continued circulating among colleagues. New hires heard their names spoken with respect, as though the pilots were still part of the community. The cargo hub, in its own way, carried their legacy forward with every dawn departure that lifted into the sky. And so, the story of UPS Flight 2976 endured, not only in formal records or safety bulletins, but in the lived experiences of those who continued to work the ramps, pilot the aircraft, load the cargo, and guide flights through unseen currents of wind. It persisted in the steady hum of engines at daybreak, in the flicker of runway lights stretching into darkness, and in the quiet resolve of everyone who understood the profound responsibility of sending an aircraft into the air. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, could you leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on the events surrounding the UPS 2976 crash? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.